Then I reached out to neighbors who had seen Bailey regularly, asking for written statements about his behavior. Several came forward, noting how calm and disciplined he always was, even around children. But the most damning piece of evidence came unexpectedly. A neighbor who lived 2 houses down had a security camera pointed toward the street. When I explained the situation, he agreed to check his footage from the day the HOA claimed the incident occurred. The footage showed Bailey walking calmly on a leash by my side, no child in sight, no commotion, nothing out of the ordinary. The HOA's story wasn't just exaggerated, it was a complete fabrication. Armed with this evidence, my lawyer and I added the false accusation to our growing case. What had started as a simple violation of disability law was now shaping into a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and outright defamation. Each move the HOA made was digging them deeper into a hole they wouldn't be able to climb out of. But even as the legal case strengthened, the social isolation grew worse. Some neighbors didn't want to hear evidence. They clung to the story because it was easier to believe the board than to question authority. The air in the neighborhood was thick with tension. Kids avoided my front yard. Conversations hushed when I walked by. The HOA's smear campaign had left scars that couldn't be undone with paperwork alone. Still, I pushed forward. The investigation by the Fair Housing Authority was now officially underway, and the board members were being forced to hand over records and respond to inquiries. For the first time, they were the ones on the defensive. And as pressure mounted, cracks began to show. At the next HOA meeting, I attended with Bailey at my side, documents in hand. The room was tense, filled with residents waiting to hear the board's latest decree. When the president of the HOA repeated the lie about Bailey biting a child, I stood up and calmly presented the evidence. I laid out the animal control report, the witness statements, and finally, the security camera footage. The room fell silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their confidence faltering as the truth played out on screen. Some residents looked shocked, others looked betrayed. For the first time, people began questioning the board instead of me. The HOA president tried to dismiss the evidence as irrelevant and claimed the community still had a right to set standards, but the damage was done. Their credibility had taken a major hit. What they had framed as a battle for the community's safety was now being exposed as a vendetta built on lies. I walked out of that meeting with my head held high. Bailey trotted beside me, unaware of the drama swirling around him, his calm presence reminding me of why I was fighting so hard. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The board wasn't untouchable. Their power wasn't absolute. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Cornered people lash out, and the HOA was nothing if not stubborn. They had been embarrassed, and they wouldn't forgive me for it. If anything, I expected them to fight even harder. And I was right. The very next week, a new tactic appeared. The HOA began targeting me financially. They issued fabricated maintenance violations against my property, claims about overgrown grass, chipped paint, even accusations that my trash cans weren't properly stored. Each notice came with a fine attached, and together they added up quickly. It was clear what they were doing. If they couldn't take Bailey from Erectly, they would try to bury me in financial penalties until I broke. But what they didn't realize was that every fabricated fine, every bogus claim, was just more ammunition for my case. We weren't wearing me down, they were building my victory. And then, things took a darker turn. One evening, while Bailey and I were returning from a walk, I found a note shoved under my front door. Unlike the official HOA letters, this one was handwritten. The words were scrawled in messy ink, dripping with malice. Get rid of the dog or else. For the first time, I felt genuine fear. This wasn't just about fines or meetings anymore. This was personal. Someone in the neighborhood had crossed a line. Someone wanted me gone. I reported the note to the police, but without a name or proof, there wasn't much they could do. Still, I kept the note, knowing it added to the growing pile of evidence. Every scrap of intimidation, every fabricated fine, every baseless threat, they were all pieces of a puzzle that painted the same picture: a corrupt HOA abusing its power. Through it all, Bailey remained steady. He seemed to sense the weight pressing down on me. On the hardest nights, when sleep refused to come and my mind spiraled with worry, Bailey would lie by my side, his steady breathing grounding me. In those moments, I remembered why I couldn't give up. Losing him wasn't just unthinkable, it was impossible. With my lawyer's guidance, we decided it was time to strike back in earnest. We drafted a formal complaint to the state's Fair Housing Authority and the Department of Justice. The complaint detailed every letter, every fine, every act of harassment. It wasn't just a defense, it was an accusation, a declaration that the HOA had crossed into illegal territory. Filing that complaint felt like a turning point. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting, I was taking action. And the moment the HOA received notice of the investigation, everything in the neighborhood shifted. The board members, who once carried themselves with smug authority, suddenly looked rattled. Their tone in letters changed, the harsh language softening into something almost cautious. It was clear they hadn't expected me to fight back with the law on my side. They thought intimidation alone would work. They thought wrong. But just as I began to feel a spark of hope, the HOA unveiled their most outrageous tactic yet. At the next community meeting, they stood before the residents and claimed Bailey had bitten a child. The accusation hit like a thunderclap. It was a complete fabrication, but the room erupted in whispers. Concerned parents shifted uneasily. Neighbors shot me accusing looks. The board had moved from bending the truth to outright lying, willing to invent dangers to turn the community against me. That was when I realized the fight wasn't just about Bailey anymore. It was about exposing the HOA for what they really were, a corrupt group willing to trample anyone who stood in their way. And I was ready to bring their lies crashing down. The accusation that Bailey had bitten a child spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, whispers had turned into full-blown rumors. Parents eyed me suspiciously as they walked their children to school. A neighbor who once greeted me with a smile now pulled her son closer when I passed. It was as if the board's lie had instantly erased years of Bailey's impeccable record. The cruelty of it all stung deeply. Bailey had never harmed anyone. His training was precise, his temperament calm. He was a protector, not a threat. But the HOA didn't care about truth. They cared about victory. And if fabricating a story about a child being bitten would rally the community against me, they were more than willing to stoop that low. I refused to let the lie stand. I knew that if I didn't fight back immediately, Bailey's reputation, and by extension my case, would be destroyed. I began gathering every shred of evidence I could. First, I requested official reports from Anonymous. All control. If there had been a real bite, there would be a record. There wasn't. Yet even as I walked out of the courthouse with Bailey at my side, I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. The ruling was clear, but reputations don't mend overnight. The board members, humiliated and exposed, still held their positions of power, and people like that rarely let go quietly. As Bailey and I stepped into the sunlight, I felt both victorious and wary. I had stood my ground, fought for my rights, and won. But I could sense that the HOA, even in defeat, wasn't finished. And what happened next in the neighborhood would prove just how deeply their corruption ran. The days following the courtroom victory felt different, almost surreal. For the first time in months, I could walk Bailey through the neighborhood without the weight of fear pressing down on me. The letters stopped, the threats disappeared, and the fabricated fines were wiped clean. On paper, it was over. But in reality, the fallout was only just beginning. The HOA had been exposed, not just in court, but in front of the very residents they claimed to protect. The emails, the lies, the smear campaigns, everything had been laid bare. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered in outrage, not about me this time, but about the board members who had abused their power. At first, the board tried to cling to authority. They downplayed the court ruling, calling it a misunderstanding, and insisting they had acted in the community's best interest. But their words no longer carried weight. The people who once trusted them now saw them for what they were, manipulators who had wasted community funds on a vendetta. The tide shifted rapidly. Residents began attending HOA meetings in numbers larger than ever before. Voices that had once been silent now demanded accountability. Questions about where dues had gone, why the board had pursued frivolous legal battles, and who had approved such reckless actions filled the room. The board members, once so smug and confident, looked small under the weight of scrutiny. And then, one by one, they began to resign. Some left quietly, slipping away without a word. Others tried to defend themselves, but were shouted down by neighbors who had lost patience. Within months, the board had crumbled, replaced by new faces who promised transparency and fairness. The transformation in the neighborhood was striking. The tension that had hung in the air began to lift. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped to apologize. Parents brought their children over to pet Bailey, no longer afraid of the lies they had been told. For the first time since moving in, I felt a true sense of community, one built not on fear, but on respect. Bailey, of course, remained blissfully unaware of the role he had played in bringing down an entire HOA board. To him, life was simple: morning walks, evening rests, and staying by my side no matter what. But I knew. I knew that his quiet presence had been the reason I hadn't given up, the anchor that had kept me steady in the storm. Looking back, it amazed me how far things had spiraled. What began as a single outrageous letter had grown into a full-scale war, exposing the corruption of an organization that thought itself untouchable. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the law. And most of all, they had underestimated the power of truth. In the end, the HOA didn't just lose in court. They lost their reputation, their authority, and the blind loyalty of the community. Their downfall became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and lies are exposed. For me, the victory wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming my home, my peace, and my right to live without fear. I no longer felt like an outsider in my own neighborhood. I felt like someone who had ear, kned their place, not by bowing to authority, but by standing firm against it. I decided it was time to push back harder. I contacted a disability rights lawyer and explained everything. The lawyer didn't hesitate. He told me the HOA was in clear violation of federal law and that I had grounds for legal action. Hearing those words was like a spark in the darkness. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't alone. Still, before taking things to court, the lawyer suggested sending a formal letter of our own, a demand that the HOA immediately stop their harassment and recognize Bailey as a protected service animal. With his guidance, I drafted the letter and sent it to the HOA board. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would scare them into backing off. But instead of retreating, the HOA doubled down. At the next board meeting, they announced publicly that I was endangering the community with an unapproved animal. They framed it as if they were protecting residents, twisting the narrative into one where they were the heroes and I was the villain. They even hinted that if I didn't comply, they might pursue legal action against me for violating the community covenants. It was surreal, watching the truth bend and break under their control. I had never felt more singled out in my life. Neighbors I had once exchanged friendly waves with now crossed the street to avoid me. It was working. The HOA's smear campaign was turning me into an outcast. But what they didn't realize was that their arrogance was fueling my resolve. They thought I would cave under pressure, but all they were doing was giving me more evidence, more reason, and more fire to fight back. As I left that board meeting, with Bailey walking steadily at my side, I knew the battle had officially begun. The HOA wasn't going to stop. But neither was I. And the next move I made would change everything. The weeks that followed the board meeting marked a shift in the conflict. What had started as a series of cold letters had now turned into open hostility. Every time I stepped outside with Bailey, I could feel the stares. Some neighbors whispered behind their curtains. Others muttered comments loud enough for me to hear. The once friendly street had turned into a battlefield, and I was the enemy. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was action. One morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice stuck to my front door. It declared me in breach of the HOA's animal policy and listed fines that had supposedly accumulated since the day of their first warning. The total already sat at nearly $2,000. $2,000. For having a service dog that the law protected. I took the notice down with shaking hands, anger boiling beneath the surface. They weren't even trying to hide their harassment anymore. This wasn't about rules or harmony. It was about punishing me into submission. The fines weren't enforceable, but that didn't matter. Their strategy was clear. Bury me in threats, isolate me from the community, and break me down until I surrendered. That same week, the harassment escalated further. My lawyer and I received a formal letter from the HOA's legal team. It was filled with legal jargon, claiming Bailey was an unauthorized emotional support animal and therefore not protected under the law. The distinction was deliberate and misleading. Emotional support animals were not granted the same protections as service dogs. By twisting Bailey's role, they hoped to create enough confusion to scare me off. But what they didn't realize was that I had every piece of documentation proving Bailey's status as a trained service dog. Certificates, medical letters, training logs. It was all there. I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't backing down. Still, the HOA's campaign of pressure was taking its toll. Simple routines became exhausting. Checking the mail felt like walking into enemy territory. Every walk with Bailey was laced with tension. The silence of neighbors heavier than words. The sense of isolation grew stronger with each passing day. And as Bailey lay at my feet one quiet evening, the neighborhood calm once again, I realized the truth of it all. Sometimes the smallest battles, like the fight to keep a service dog, can spark the biggest changes. The HOA had tried to ban my service dog. Their excuse had been outrageous, but in the end, their corruption destroyed them, and Bailey and I walked away stronger than ever.